Irene Bankole lived in a house that felt more like a fortress than a home. It was a grand mansion with tall gates and manicured lawns, nestled in the heart of the elite neighborhood of Ikoyi. Inside the mansion, everything sparkled, from the marble floors to the crystal chandeliers, but the air was heavy with rules and expectations. Irene was the only child of Mr. and Mrs. Bankole. Her father, a prominent oil magnate, was a man of discipline and precision. He built his empire from scratch, and nothing mattered to him more than maintaining his family's reputation. Her mother, a successful businesswoman, ran a chain of supermarkets across Lagos. She was equally ambitious, always striving for perfection in everything, including her daughter. From the moment Irene was born, her parents made it clear that she was special. She was their miracle child, arriving after years of waiting and countless prayers. But with that miracle came pressure to be the perfect daughter, the perfect student, and, eventually, the perfect woman. Irene's life was meticulously planned. She attended the best schools, wore the finest clothes, and ate the healthiest meals. Every hour of her day was accounted for, from piano lessons to etiquette classes. While other children played outside, Irene was indoors, practicing her French or memorizing passages from classic literature. Her parents believed they were protecting her, but Irene felt trapped. She longed for the freedom to make her own choices, to explore the world beyond the gates of their mansion. But every time she voiced her feelings, her parents dismissed her. "You'll thank us one day," her father would say, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her mother would add, "Everything we do is for your own good, Irene." And so, Irene learned to keep her dreams and frustrations to herself. At school, Irene's life wasn't much different. She attended one of the most prestigious private schools in Lagos, a place filled with children from wealthy families. But despite the glamour, Irene struggled to fit in. Her classmates saw her as aloof and reserved. In truth, Irene was painfully shy. Years of living under her parents' strict rules had left her unsure of how to connect with others. During lunch breaks, while other students laughed and shared secrets, Irene sat alone, pretending to read a book. Her teachers often praised her intelligence and discipline, but Irene wished they would notice her loneliness instead. She longed for someone to see beyond her perfect grades and designer clothes, someone who would understand the girl behind the facade. When Irene turned 15, she experienced her first crush. His name was Fred, a boy in her class with a bright smile and an easy charm. He once helped her pick up her books when she accidentally dropped them. Irene's heart raced as he smiled and said, "You should be more careful." That night, Irene lay awake, replaying the moment in her mind. But she knew better than to tell her parents. They would kill me, she thought, suppressing a sigh. By the time Irene finished secondary school, she had grown accustomed to her solitary existence. Her parents were proud of her academic achievements and wasted no time enrolling her in a prestigious university to study pharmacy. Studying pharmacy wasn't her choice. She had dreamed of becoming a nurse, but as always, her parents made the decision for her. When Irene moved to campus, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, she was away from her parents' watchful eyes. She had her own space, her own time, and a glimpse of the freedom she had always craved. During her first week in campus, while navigating the chaos of registration, Irene met Femi. He was a confident and charismatic 200-level student who seemed to know everyone. "You're new here, aren't you?" Femi asked, flashing her a friendly smile. "Yes," Irene replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, I'll show you the ropes," he said. He offered to help her with the registration process, and Irene was grateful for his kindness, because she had never done anything like this before without the help of her parents. True to his word, Femi helped her secure a good hostel and even introduced her to a few people. Irene found herself drawn to him. He was everything she wasn't: bold, outgoing, and full of life. Registration was over and Irene resumed lectures. University was a world on its own. Her lectures were so intense she hardly had time for herself. For a while she didn't see Femi again, because she was busy with school. One day her phone rang and she picked. It was Femi. "Long time, it's been a while. How have you been?" he said. "I'm fine. Lectures have been choking," Irene responded. "Let's hang out," Femi asked. Irene sounded not so sure. "You don't want to hang out?" Femi said. No, is not like that, but I am just tired. That evening Femi came and carried her to a restaurant where they ate and talked. Irene had never received any attention from a guy before, no guy has ever noticed her, she was so fascinated by Femi. Let's do this often, Femi said as he dropped her off in her hostel. Their meeting became more regular, every evening after lectures, Femi would come to the front of her hostel, they will sit under the tree for long, chatting and laughing. Femi and Irene's relationship blossomed quickly. He had a way of making her feel comfortable, of drawing her out of her shell. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing, and for the first time, Irene felt truly seen. One evening, as they sat under a tree on campus, Femi turned to her and said, "Irene, will you be my girlfriend?" The question caught her off guard, but her heart knew the answer before her mind did. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Irene started going to visit Femi in his house off campus regularly, she was almost never in her hostel again. Her roommates noticed the change in her behavior, so they confronted her. "You've changed, Irene," one of them said one evening. "I'm fine," Irene snapped, brushing her off. Being with Femi was like stepping into a new world. He introduced her to late-night hangouts, small parties, and the thrill of breaking rules. Irene, who had spent her life following her parents' strict guidelines, found the rebellion intoxicating. But it wasn't long before Femi introduced her to something darker. Femi's charm was magnetic, but beneath his easy smile lay a thrill-seeker who reveled in pushing boundaries. Irene, eager to keep up and desperate to hold on to the first taste of love and freedom she'd ever known, followed him blindly. One evening, Femi invited Irene to a party at an off-campus apartment. She hesitated at first, it was unlike anything she'd ever done, but Femi's reassuring words and her feelings for him overpowered her doubts. "Trust me," he said, taking her hand. "You'll have fun." The apartment was packed with students, the air thick with music, chatter, and the scent of alcohol. Irene clung to Femi's arm, overwhelmed but intrigued. He handed her a drink, and though she'd never tasted alcohol before, she sipped it to avoid standing out. By the end of the night, Femi introduced Irene to a group of his friends. They were loud, confident, and seemed to carry an aura of invincibility. Irene felt out of place, but Femi's presence gave her courage. "She's with me," he said, wrapping an arm around her. One of the friends, a tall girl with braided hair, handed Femi a small colorful packet. Irene watched as Femi opened it and pulled out a thin, rolled paper. He lit it, took a puff, and handed it to her. "Try it," he said casually. Irene froze. She knew what it was, her parents had warned her countless times about drugs and the dangers they posed. But here, in this room filled with laughter and confidence, she felt torn. "It's not a big deal," Femi said, reading her hesitation. "Just one puff. Everyone does it." Reluctantly, Irene took the joint. Her hands trembled as she brought it to her lips. The smoke burned her throat, and she coughed violently, much to the amusement of Femi's friends. "First time," one of them teased. Femi patted her back, laughing. "She'll get the hang of it." That night marked the beginning of a new chapter in Irene's life, a chapter filled with excitement but also a growing sense of unease. Over the next few weeks, Irene found herself spending more time with Femi and his circle. Despite her new schedule, Irene never missed her lectures. She made sure her results were good, so her parents won't notice any change. Over time, Irene and Femi began spending all their money on buying hard drugs. Her parents always sent her a lot of money, unaware of what she used it for. In her 200 level, Irene started living with Femi off campus. She packed her belongings from the hostel and moved into his house. Her parents had no idea, they thought she was still living in the hostel. Not long after she moved in, Irene started feeling sick. She experienced morning sickness and dizziness. Femi took her to the hospital, where it was confirmed she was pregnant. "I can't have this baby," Irene said. "My parents will kill me. I'm just 17. Where can I get an abortion?" she asked Femi, panic evident in her voice. Femi didn't want her to terminate the pregnancy. "We can tell your parents and get married," he suggested. "No. They will never agree. You don't know my parents, they'll say I've brought shame to the family. They will kill me. Please, Let's take it out, she begged. The next day, a friend of Feemy's took them to a hospital out of town for the abortion procedure. As Irene lay on the table, fear consumed her. Before, she had been sure she didn't want the baby, but now she was scared. What if something goes wrong? She thought. Before she could dwell on it, the doctor gave her an injection that knocked her out. The procedure was quick, in 30 minutes they were done. When she woke up, it was done. A part of her felt relieved, but another part of her felt deep regret. She felt guilty for what she had done. That night, they returned home, and life seemed to go back to normal. Irene resumed her lectures and continued with her routine. When the holiday came, Feemy stayed back in school, but Irene went home to her parents, even though she wished she could stay back in school. At home, Irene was back to living in a cage. Her parents noticed changes in her behavior. She was more hyper than usual, but they didn't think too much about it. At night, when everyone was asleep, Irene would lock herself in her room and sniff the white powder Feemy had given her. He made sure she had enough supplies to last the holiday. She would stay up late, talking to Feemy on the phone, and wake up very late the next morning. Have you noticed Irene wakes up so late these days? That's not like her, her mother said to her father. She's probably resting from the stress of school, her father replied. Irene couldn't wait for the break to be over. She missed the freedom she had in school, clubbing, living with Feemy, and doing as she pleased. One morning, she lied to her parents. Our department has asked us to resume early for practicals, she said. They believed her. She packed her bags and left for school the next day. Feemy was ecstatic to see her. He had missed her terribly. Irene resumed her life of pretense. She and Feemy went clubbing until late at night, often returning drunk. While Feemy didn't care much about his studies, Irene made sure to keep her grades up to avoid her parents noticing anything suspicious. A few months after the abortion, Irene started feeling the same way again. She missed her period and asked Feemy to get her a pregnancy test. It was positive. This time, you won't abort my child, Feemy said firmly. I will. Irene insisted. No, you won't. We'll have this baby, Feemy argued. What if something happens to you? Your parents will blame me. Irene eventually decided to keep the pregnancy, not sure how she would tell her parents, but didn't want to risk her life again. As her baby bump grew, people began to notice. Rumors spread in her class and hostel. Irene is pregnant, one lady whispered to another. Why wouldn't she be? She's living with a guy, the other lady replied. As the bump grew larger, Irene became too ashamed to attend lectures. One day, Irene's mother entered her room to look for her international passport. They had planned to surprise her with a vacation to Paris for the holiday. While searching, she found a piece of paper with a strange white powder. Alarmed, she waited for her husband to return home. At dinner, she showed him what she had found. Look at this. I found it in Irene's room, she said. What is this? Mr. Bankole asked. I don't know, which is why I'm showing you, she replied. He took it from her hand and sniffed it. Immediately, he recoiled. This is hard drugs, he said. Is Irene into drugs? Mrs. Bankole screamed. No, it's not possible. Maybe it's a mix-up, Mr. Bankole said. Perhaps the cleaner left it there. The next day, they called the cleaner, a young man who worked at their house 3 times a week. Do you know what this is? Mr. Bankole asked, showing him the substance. No, sir. I don't even know what this is, the cleaner replied. At this point, it became clear that the drugs belonged to Irene. That night, Mr. and Mrs. Bankole couldn't sleep. Where did we go wrong? Mr. Bankole asked. We gave her everything, and now she's doing drugs. Tomorrow, we're going to her school. She must explain this, he declared. The next morning, they drove 4 hours to her school. When they arrived, they went to the hostel address Irene had given them in her first year. They asked a student to call Irene from her room, but after a while, the student returned, saying no one by that name lived there. Can I see her picture? Maybe I'll recognize her, the student offered. Mr. Bankole showed her Irene's picture. Oh, I know her. She's my coursemate. Though it's been a while since I saw her in class, but I know where she lives now. She stays off campus, the student said. Mr. and Mrs. Bankole exchanged uneasy glances. The student directed them to Irene's lodge off campus. When they arrived, they saw Femi coming out of one of the rooms. We're looking for Irene. We heard she stays here, they said to him. Just as they were speaking, Irene came out, about to leave with Femi to buy groceries. She froze at the sight of her parents. Irene, her parents shouted. What are you doing here? She stammered. Her father's face turned red. Why is your stomach big? Are you pregnant? No, it can't be. I can explain, Irene stammered, trembling as she glanced at Femi, hoping he'd say something to help. But Femi stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if words had abandoned him entirely. Irene, Mr. Bankole roared, stepping closer to her. Explain what? That you've been living a lie. That you've been cohabiting with this man? That you're carrying a child out of wedlock? After everything we've done for you? Tears streamed down Irene's face. I'm sorry, Daddy, I didn't plan for this to happen. I just wanted to be happy. Happy? Mrs. Bankole's voice broke, her trembling hand pointing at Irene's belly. You think this mess is happiness? Drugs? A pregnancy? Lies? Have we not given you everything you've ever wanted? Why, Irene? Why? Irene's voice cracked under the weight of her guilt and fear. Because you never let me make my own choices. You controlled every aspect of my life. I didn't know how to live, and I still don't. I'm sorry, but this is all your fault too. The words hit her parents like a slap. For a moment, silence lingered, interrupted only by the distant hum of passing cars. Femi finally spoke up, his voice shaky. Sir, I take full responsibility for what happened. I love Irene, and I want to do right by her. We can raise this baby together. You. Mr. Bankole spat, his face red with anger. You're the one who dragged my daughter into this mess. Drugs, pregnancy, living off campus. You are the reason for all of this. No, Dad, Irene said, stepping in front of Femi. Don't blame him. I made my own choices. And I love him. Love? Mrs. Bankole shouted, her voice breaking. Irene, you're 17. What do you know about love? This boy has destroyed your future, and you're calling it love. As Irene sobbed, the landlord of the lodge came out, startled by the commotion. What's going on here? He asked. Who are you? Mr. Bankole demanded. I'm the landlord of this lodge, the man replied. This is my daughter, Mr. Bankole pointed at Irene. Do you know she's underage? Do you allow this nonsense to happen here? The landlord sighed, rubbing his temple. Sir, I didn't know she was underage. Most students here are adults. Please, let's not escalate this. Escalate? Mrs. Bankole hissed. This is already beyond escalation. Irene's parents demanded that she pack her belongings immediately. Femi pleaded with them, but they wouldn't hear another word from him. Tears streaming, Irene grabbed her things, knowing there was no way out. As they drove home, the silence in the car was deafening. Her parents didn't say a word, and Irene didn't dare speak. Once home, they locked her in her room and confiscated her phone. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and share. See you in my next story.